Now, ladies and gentlemen, everybody, it's my great pleasure to give you Tracie Harris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tracie Harris, and you probably know me best from the Atheist Experience, also on Godless Bitches and Atheist Eve comic strip. So this particular talk was an hour and a half, and I've got it down to 30 minutes somehow, and we're going to try to get through this. Luckily, there's a break after this talk, so I did practice it about 3 times, and it worked, so we'll see how this goes. So first of all, thanks to everybody at Kentucky Freethought for having me today. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank everybody that came out to support this effort. It couldn't happen without you. The first thing I want to say is that there's a lot of information in this particular presentation that is in fields that I am not expert in. And I want to assure everybody that I did use experts to check out my slides and check out my understanding of these concepts in psychology to make sure that what I was about to say is not way off base as far as how these ideas and models are presented in the reality of psychology. Additionally, one of the reasons that I have this talk is that as a person that was indoctrinated and did come out of that and deconvert, I hear a lot of conversations on the one side from people who have never been indoctrinated that let me know that they don't really understand what that means. And on the other side of it, I have people that come up to me that have been indoctrinated very heavily, and they come to me basically telling these horror stories, and it means something to them that they have other people they can talk to who have been in that situation, who are now out of it, and they can communicate with them to share that experience, because it's very isolating as a human being to have an experience that you feel is not shared by many people, and you don't necessarily come into contact with people that can relate to you. And when you do tell people about it and they haven't had the experience, you realize how isolated you are, because their responses show you that they don't know what you're talking about, or that they think they do and they don't. And with that, that's kind of what I wanted to accomplish with this talk. Was I had looked myself for many years to try and find an answer to what does that mean? What is it? What does it mean to be indoctrinated? I had never heard an explanation that resonated, that was emotionally or experientially satisfying to describe what I had gone through. And with that, it was very disturbing to me, because this is something that so many people have experienced, and yet there doesn't seem to be a body of work dedicated to explaining it. And so I want to also note that this is going to involve authoritarian conservative religion. Not everybody that went to church was indoctrinated. Not all religions are indoctrinating people. Sometimes they're just talking about what they believe, and you can believe it, not believe it, and they don't care. That's not the religions I'm talking about, all right? We're talking about authoritarian, conservative religious groups. One of the things I like to ask people to see whether or not I think that they've gone through an indoctrination experience is, would you have died for your beliefs? And a number of people say, yes, I would have died for my beliefs. As a person that's come out of indoctrination, you could put a gun to my head and ask me to renounce any belief I hold, and I will renounce it like on the spot. You don't even need to, it's just the threat alone. So the idea that you would die for your beliefs, to me, is kind of a red flag that, yes, you were indoctrinated. There was also something that I found, and we're going to go through it. Keep in mind commitment and exploration. So we all believe that we have explored our beliefs. And when you tell somebody that was indoctrinated or that is indoctrinated that they didn't explore it, that they didn't look into it, it's kind of an offensive thing, because they spent usually a lot of time. The people that were most indoctrinated generally put the most time into consistent study and consistently looking into their beliefs. And so when they hear you saying that they didn't really think about it or they haven't explored it, that you're going to get a very defensive negative reaction, because they don't agree with you. But what's weird is when people come out of it, they'll say, I didn't know, there was a lot of information I didn't know about, I didn't understand, and I didn't really look into it, but when you're telling them that while they're in it, they think they did. And so for me, part of the indoctrination, it's that there's a trick that they do that makes people feel like they have explored something when they haven't. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Indoctrination means that you're creating something, in my opinion. This is the part that's my opinion, right? So the psychiatrist that vetted my slides is not promoting that what I'm about to say as far as the opinions of how I relate this to religion are necessarily correct. That's my belief. But there's something called a foreclosed identity. And I think that religious indoctrination is simply a recipe for creating that. It means getting people to commit to something powerfully while you get them to also believe they've explored it, whether they have or not. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and start these slides. The reason it's called self-destruction is because I believe it is an attempted destruction of one's personal identity. So with this first slide, the indoctrinated person will say things a lot of times, and I said these things myself once I came out of it, that didn't make sense. All right? When you say, my mind, it was like my mind was not my own, or my beliefs weren't my beliefs. Well, this makes no sense. And if I'm trying to explain something to you and I'm saying things that don't make sense, that doesn't help. I sound like one of the callers on the show where I used to criticize. But what they're trying to express is that after they deconvert, there is a fundamental qualitative difference in what constitutes what they believe and what they feel as beliefs. The beliefs I have now don't feel like the beliefs I had then, and I don't know why. And this is what plagued me, and this is what is plaguing a lot of people that come out of religion, and there is no answer given to them for this. What you hear from people that weren't indoctrinated are things like, well, we've all been wrong before, and we've all, indoctrination is just education, and I still hear that. The problem with it is that I went through public education, and I've been wrong about a lot of things, and I'm telling you it's not indoctrination. I've experienced all of those things, and they are all distinctly different. Even being educated about something that's incorrect and being corrected later is not indoctrination. It is not the experience I'm trying to explain. We all have an intuition about it, right? We say you get them while they're young, or you tell somebody something often enough. We know intuitively that there is something to that, and yet sometimes you hear something a lot of times and it still sounds ridiculous. So there's something more going on. So I came across this article written by Dr. Dombeck, and he was describing a situation where he was overseeing a number of student psychologists who were involved in an internship, and one of them had a patient that he was specifically interested in. And the thing that interested him was that it seemed to him that this guy's religion was playing a role in his psychopathology. And he pondered in this that the patient belonged to a fairly strict church, and his practical identity seemed to be mostly concerned about suppressing his natural identity. So he perceived the natural identity to be sinful, and he was suppressing that in favor of a different identity. And I thought, well, yeah, isn't that just religion? I mean, that's what that is. Well, apparently that's not all, a lot of Christians are from liberal Christian backgrounds where it's just not that big a deal. But when you're involved in what I'm calling indoctrination, this is what it is. It's about killing who you are and replacing it with who you aren't. And you cannot do that. So there was another psychologist, Carl Rogers, who was involved in identity studies, and he suggested that if you leave people to their own devices, they're going to choose the things that he called it organismically preferred. Big word that just means you're going to do what you like. And Dombeck agreed with Rogers that we should allow people to do what they like, and that when you impede them from expressing themselves in a way that is their identity, that you're going to do damage to the person. This brought me to this model. This is a basic identity status model. So just to give you all an idea, this thing can grow huge with tons of prongs, but this is the very basic thing, right? This is the smallest version of this model. And what you're looking at are 4 different types of identity: foreclosed, achieved, diffuse, and moratorium. You've got commitment and exploration that are the 2 prongs of this thing. And you have low and high, right? So you could have explored something a great deal, or maybe you didn't explore it much. You can have a commitment to your ideal, like your ideology or your beliefs, that is very high or very low. So when you have a person that's diffuse, they don't have a great deal of commitment to much, and they really don't care. They're not interested in looking into things. They just kind of go through life like that feather on the wind. When you've got someone in moratorium, they aren't committed to anything, but they're very high in exploration. This is a person who may be studying a lot, but they're just not really committed to anything. And that doesn't mean, these things aren't necessarily static. You can move around in here, right? So with moratorium, most people are in moratorium before they move up to achieved, right? So you're looking around, then you start committing to things after you start getting more and more information. And that's when you start to move into an achievement. Foreclosed is what got my attention. Foreclosed is when you have very little exploration of your ideas, but you're super committed to them. And if you notice, achievement and foreclosure both have high commitment levels. But when you test people out, the foreclosed identity has slightly higher commitment. So ironically, when you've explored very little, you're more committed to the beliefs that you hold, which is really weird. But just to give you a quick sideline, I guess, on that, the idea is that when you've gone through achievement, you realize how much information is required and how information can change a belief, so you're less likely to be more solid in your commitments because you understand they can change. So I read this section of another article by James Marcia. Now, James Marcia is very early in identity studies, but kind of, I want to say like the father of identity studies. There was a little bit before him, but he really is the one that broke it and said, okay, we're going to talk about identity. He came up, I think, with that model that I just showed. But his idea was that the variable of commitment could not be the sole criterion for ego identity. The individual about to become a Methodist Republican farmer, like his Methodist Republican farmer father with little or no thought in the matter, certainly cannot be said to have achieved an identity in spite of his commitment. So what he's saying is that if you have commitment but no exploration, yes, you have an identity, but you didn't achieve it. And if you have commitment and exploration, you have achieved it. So you've worked for that, for those beliefs. You've worked hard to come to an understanding of what you believe. You didn't just adopt it. And it's interesting, I read this once to a friend of mine who actually, his family were Methodist Republican farmers. And he thought I made that up. He's like, oh, why are you using that? And I said, no, that's the quote. That's the actual quote. So it made me think about what it means to explore, because like I said, when you talk to somebody that was indoctrinated or I want to say when you talk to somebody that is indoctrinated, they're going to really punch back when you say they didn't explore. And what I started to realize as I was looking more and more into this is that exploration is kind of a relative thing, right? So in the first picture, you see a child digging in a sandbox. You can put a kid in a sandbox and it's got little boundaries around it, right? So there's this small space that the child is allowed to dig through. And if you tell that child to just keep digging, right? You can dig as deep as you want, you can dig all day long from 24/7, as much as you want, just dig away. That kid can do a lot of work, but there won't be a whole lot of there's a lot of effort, but not much work gets done, right? So he's putting in a lot of effort, not doing much. Whenever you get the chance to start deconverting, it's like stepping outside of that sandbox and realizing that you've got this backhoe's, I mean, you could just dig with a backhoe forever and you're never going to get to the bottom of the information, right? The universe is full of information. So what the person that's in indoctrination is experiencing is that they're working very hard because they're digging in that sandbox like a mad person, but they're not getting anywhere. They don't know that, because they've been set to work. And so all they know is I'm putting in a lot of effort into what I believe. And this is where I think the disconnect really starts to come in, because we're looking at it from an exterior standpoint and saying you haven't explored, and they're looking at it like, you've got to be kidding me. Nobody's read as much about religion as I have. And they're probably right, but it's the wrong kind of effort, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. So I had a foreclosed identity. I was indoctrinated. I was physically healthy. I had great grades. I was well behaved. I was motivated by positive attention. I was well liked and social. I had no addiction problems. I wasn't ever involved in abusive romantic relationships. I was college and career oriented. Don't I sound like a mess? I was like all my friends' parents loved me, right? It was like, that's who you need to be. My friends were starting to hate me. And so I had to write to Dr. Dombeck and say, okay, so what's wrong with it? Like, why is this wrong? And he said this was a personal correspondence. He said a person with foreclosed identity would be forever in a state of internal dissonance, would experience at some level, noticed consciously or not, internal conflict, stress, pain, and be very shame-prone. And I thought, why didn't I think of that when I was thinking of what's wrong with me? When I was putting together that list of all the things that were okay with me, why didn't I stop and think, yeah, but I thought I was an utter failure all the time. And isn't that a problem? Isn't it a problem to say I had all these great things about me, but let's say I was gay and I couldn't be out and gay? Boy, would I notice it then, right? But because the things that they were suppressing were like, sexual taboos and other things about personal identity that human beings generally, I think one of the speakers earlier today said something about just being fun and being a person, right? They make you feel bad about that. And I'm sitting here looking at all these external things saying, but I was such a great kid. But you bet I was hitting my knees every night and praying for forgiveness, and that, I was guilty for everything and I was never going to be good enough, because that's what it means to be a Christian in that vein. So he said a modern successor to Rogers' work is acceptance and commitment therapy, which discusses psychological flexibility as the core construct underlying whether psychopathology will be present or not. A person with a foreclosed identity would not exhibit such flexibility and instead would be quite rigidly clinging to introjected beliefs. We're going to go through some of this terminology, so don't worry about it. Part of what I'm hoping people can take away today, if they have either been through indoctrination and want to know more about what happened to them, or if you're just personally interested in this as somebody who wasn't indoctrinated, because this talk is going so quickly, write down anything you don't recognize that you think might be helpful and look it up later. So with that, the takeaway here is if you don't have psychological flexibility, which is absent in foreclosed identities, you're going to be looking at potential psychopathologies. But I want to look at that first paragraph again. Internal conflict, stress, pain, and shame prone. This is what fundamentalism tells you is a good thing. So fundamentalists praise this, right? So you are recognizing your inherent depravity as a failed human, right? As the human from the fall. And you're supposed to be appreciative of that forgiveness that God gives you for your imperfections. And so you look at yourself as like this doomed, horrid creature that has been, this wretched thing that has been offered salvation even though you don't deserve it. And that's how you live your life. And when you see somebody that's not living that way, somebody who's being fun and being a person and having a good time and being themselves, you say, oh, that poor, poor person going to hell. And I pity them. I pity them, their wretched state that they don't even know they're in. They think they're happy and having a good time and mentally healthy, but boy, they're going to not a different opinion when they hit hell, right? So constant failure, which he's saying this is the problem, I'm looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, even as an adult, even as a deconvert for over 10 years, I'm trying to figure out what was wrong with me, and I couldn't even remember this, right? It's like I didn't remember this as a negative. How messed up is that? So what kind of pathologies go with inflexibility? Foreclosed identity, inflexible problems. So in a broad number of studies and scores, they found scores indicating low psychological flexibility that were found to predict all of these things that are messed up on my slides. I guess the fonts didn't come through. So some of this stuff is kind of weird looking. But there's a lot of bad things. And that one that starts with DOH is actually something called alexithymia, which is very interesting, and I would encourage anybody to look that up just as a point of interest, right? So a lot of people with autism are alexithymic, and some people who are, many people who are psychopaths are alexithymic, but there's other people who are just normal, they seem like normal people, but they're alexithymic, and it means that they don't recognize or process emotions. So they go through life with very limited emotional feedback and very limited emotional understanding, and sometimes they don't even recognize that there's something different until way later in life when they start realizing people keep talking about these things in ways that I don't understand. Usually they just think, oh, I'm not that emotional. It's like they're probably just not getting the feedback. I apologize for that slide. So this is another model, and this was put out, this is part of the ACT, the ACT thing that I mentioned earlier, structural analysis of social behavior. And what this is showing is a little bit different. You are supposed to have access to all of these things. When they're talking about psychological flexibility, imagine that you are a circle in the middle of, let me see if this works. Okay, so if you can see the cursor, no you can't. Well, if you imagine a circle that is around the cross in the center, that's where a person should be. That's flexibility. And what that means is that you have access to ignoring, to affirming, to protecting, and to blaming, right? And we can all think of examples when, for example, let's say that you come to me and say that I've done some real harm, that I'm responsible for really doing harm to somebody, to you or someone else. And you're right. I should be able to blame myself, right? I should be able to take responsibility for that and say, yeah, you're right, I'm at fault for this and I need to fix it. But when you come to me and you criticize me for things I didn't do wrong or things that aren't my fault, I need to be able to protect myself. I need to be able to say, no, you're wrong. I'm not going to go into blame for this. I'm going to protect myself from you. And if you keep doing it to me, I'm going to make a boundary to protect myself where you're not allowed to come and see me anymore. I don't want to talk to you. I might affirm myself if you try to put me down. Or I may not affirm myself if you're telling me that there's something wrong here that I need to be aware of that's not so great. And I might want to ignore a criticism if I look at it and it's not valid. or I might want to actually not ignore it if it is valid, right? So all of these things can be good or bad, and they're just labeled as emancipating, attacking, loving, and controlling based on kind of how they're defined. But in the end, you should be able to attack yourself, and you should be able to protect yourself, and you should be able to love yourself, but not so much that it causes you problems. You should be able to free yourself, but not to the point that you can't control yourself, right? So it's just, you need to have access to all these things. That's flexibility. Introjection was another term we talked about. So introjection, real quickly, there's how I see myself, and there's how you see me, and there's how I see you, and then there's how I see you seeing me. And that's introjection. So introjection is, what do I think you think of me? And when you give introjection repeatedly to a child, you can impact that child by confusing them about what it is they think about themselves. So if a parent continually tells a child, you never do anything right, that child, if they hear it once or twice, no problem. If they hear it every time they make a mistake, suddenly it's not just, oops, I made a mistake, it's, oops, I made a mistake and I never do anything right. They internalize that representation, and it's actually in some papers put forward as a small model of the parent that resides in the child's head. They describe it that way as a model. What they're saying is that this is not the child's own perception, it's a representation of the parent's perspective, which the child has internalized and confused with their own, and I have come to be convinced that this is the difference between the beliefs that I held when I was indoctrinated and the beliefs that I hold now that I have come to from doing my own investigation. I think that these were introjected beliefs, and that when people are saying, I don't know how to describe it, but there's this quality, I think they're trying to describe the difference between a belief they've come to on their own and a belief that has been introjected. So how authoritarian conservative religions use these tools? Remember, we're looking at commitment and we're looking at investigation, right? So introjecting blame. The indoctrination of Christianity, when it comes to fundamental authoritarianism, is about you deserve to die because you are so depraved. Because of the fall of Adam, all of mankind is depraved and deserves to die. And Jesus died for you, and you are responsible for that death, and you must now spend the rest of your life making up for that. So you deserve this blame. And they tell that child that enough to where in a lot of children it's going to become introjected. Then they're going to interject an identity. The purpose of your life is to serve and glorify God. And in the hour-and-a-half version of this, I just had a slide with nothing but quotes from religious websites expressing these ideas. So there is no doubt that this is what they're telling people. Then how do they get you to commit? Well, first of all, they apply pressure. What if you die unsaved, right? So you need to make this commitment. You need to do this, and you need to not spend too much time thinking about it. You need to make the commitment, and you need to really be committed because this is life and death, and this is your eternal soul at risk. And then they'll inoculate you with propaganda, so they'll tell you about, oh, this is the ridiculous stuff that Buddhists believe, here's the ridiculous stuff that the Catholics believe, here's the ridiculous things atheists are going to believe if Satan has led them astray. And even science is saying all these crazy things. You are slime that came out of, the ocean, and then you were a monkey, and now you're, going to college. So whatever, this is science. So they tell you these things, and you think to yourself, I went to the class that we had on Buddhism at my church, and so I understand Buddhism. I know what Buddhists believe. I've researched this. I have investigated this. And how do they keep you in that sandbox, right? So they promote that faith justifies belief, which is just saying, if you believe, you believe. They say you need to pray for signs and revelations, you have to seek with your heart, and so you've got a person that's running around looking for signs and praying really hard, and to them this is work, right? This is work and effort that they're putting into this belief. And how do they deter you from actual investigation? Well, they tell you that your doubts are from the devil. That's the devil, he's crafty, he makes the science sometimes sound like it makes sense, but you need to just know that's the clever trick of Satan. Don't believe it, it's dangerous. It's going to put you in hell for eternity if you listen too much to that. Don't listen to it. And don't test God, right? Whatever you do, you don't put it to a test. And if somebody tells you to put it to a test, that's just Satan being clever again, right? So you just don't doubt, don't put it to a test, and you just keep on studying and believing as hard as you can and seeking with your heart and checking your emotions and knowing that you're right with God. And you work and work and work and work, but you're getting nowhere. But you feel like you're working. And so when someone tells you you weren't, it sounds ludicrous to you. So where do you explore then, and where don't you explore? Well, you can explore at answers in Genesis, right? And they'll tell you all about, creation. And you can explore at the Discover Institute, right? The Center for Science and Culture, right? We all know how sciencey the Discovery Institute is. And then they, again, misrepresent science goals. They misrepresent other ideologies. So they're keeping you in that sandbox by keeping you busy digging in the sandbox. And you don't know that you're not going anywhere because you feel like you're just working so hard, this effort's got to be paying off. And what about those achieved identities that you pity? LifeSite News, if you've ever visited this site, is nothing but just like an ode to the condemnation of individual agency. That absolutely anything you can do that is outside of what God is telling you to do is evil. So you shouldn't have any kind of agency, you should never be doing what you want, you should never be doing anything that's fun. You should be just surrendering to God, you should be resisting sin, which is basically just a way of saying, hammer your identity into the ground. You need to do God's will and not your own. You need to not trust your own wisdom. These are all things that you're hearing all the time in these churches. And the slave and servant language is just pervasive. And lastly, I love this picture, right? So it's a dog dressed as a bumblebee, I'm guessing. He's not a bee. He's a dog. And his identity is dog, not bee. And so he needs to go with his natural dog identity and not his bumblebee identity because you're making him feel bad. And he did not shoot anything to deserve this. So promoting a foreclosed identity is what I think indoctrination is really about. And I've started using that as a metric. When people ask me what is indoctrination to me, I say if it's going after your identity, you're probably being indoctrinated. If it's not going after your identity, then it's probably just you're being told something that's not right. And you can get away from that, it's fine. But when you walk away from something that really latches onto your identity, you lose the whole worldview. Like it comes out like a rug under your feet and it's like waking up out of the matrix, and it is not the same as just being wrong about a thing. But the result of this, of the attack on the person and the introjected identity and the restricted exploration, is that you're creating psychologically inflexible personalities. They're clinging to introjected identities. They're in a constant state of internal conflict that they believe is necessary, and it can only be temporarily remedied by renewed commitment to rejecting the natural identity in order to avoid total destruction. They're putting children at risk of a litany of common psychological disorders, but most importantly, it's what keeps them bound to the church. And I think that was it. I think I made it. Did I make it? Did I really keep it in half an hour? Are there questions? I don't know if we have. Do we have time for questions? How much time is there? What time is it? Okay, so I got 2 minutes. I don't know if there'd be any questions, but yeah.
Tracie, is there a link where we can see your full presentation?
Yes.
There's really not. I don't have a platform anymore, so
Have you written a book?
I have not. But if I did, I would write this because this is information. It disturbs me that there is no psychology of indoctrination. Because I think that this is, I mean, if you want to find out about it, just look for identity psychology, right? And James Marsha, Rogers, Don Beck has done a number of articles, although I don't know if he's still working at it. But yes, it's all about foreclosed identity is what you're looking for.
Just can we post the PDF that you gave us?
Yeah, and maybe work on that one slide.
Probably when the PDF was converted to...
Okay.
Probably the PDF is okay.
Okay.
And we can post that on the website on Facebook.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks everybody for attending, and I just really appreciate your support for this event.